Kimberly stood before Enzo, the air thick and heavy, each breath a conscious effort. The smell of old leather and expensive cologne hung in the room, a familiar scent that usually brought a strange comfort. But today it felt like a cage. The deal, the one that was supposed to secure their biggest win of the year, had gone south in a spectacular fashion. Papers were scattered across the polished mahogany table, some crumpled, others with angry red marks slashing through them. Enzo's face was a mask. His eyes, usually quick to show a flicker of amusement or irritation, were now just cold, unwavering points of ice. His gaze locked onto her, and Kimberly felt a familiar tension tighten in her jaw. She could feel her lower lip, a habit she'd had since she was a little girl, wanting to pull between her teeth. It was a nervous habit, a way to hold herself together when the world felt like it was crumbling. Enzo leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. "If you bite your lip again, Kimberly," he started, each word carefully placed, "there will be consequences." He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was clear, hanging in the air between them like a physical thing. Kimberly's breath hitched, but she forced herself to keep still. Her lip, despite its urge, remained untouched. She met his stare, a flicker of defiance, small and private, burning deep within her. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not now, not ever. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Enzo's hand, large and powerful, suddenly slammed down on the table. The sharp crack echoed, making Kimberly flinch, but she quickly regained her composure. The sound vibrated through the floor, a stark punctuation mark to his warning. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat, but her face remained carefully blank. Little did he know, her silence was a storm brewing, not a surrender. It was the quiet before a different kind of thunder, a prelude to something he couldn't possibly see coming. Her mind was racing, a whirlwind of thoughts and calculations, but outwardly she was still unreadable. Enzo's jaw was clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek, a clear sign of his barely contained fury. He held her gaze for another long moment, searching perhaps for a crack in her composure, a sign of fear or remorse. But Kimberly gave him nothing. Her eyes, usually expressive, were now a blank slate. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, a tangible thing that pressed down on them both. He looked away first, a sharp, frustrated sigh escaping his lips. Kimberly didn't move, didn't breathe until she heard the soft whoosh of his chair as he pushed back from the table. The consequences he spoke of could be anything. With Enzo, they always were. They could be a quiet demotion, a public shaming, or something far worse, something that lingered, something that stripped away more than just her job. She had seen it before, the way he dealt with those who crossed him, those who disappointed him, and she had definitely disappointed him today. The silence stretched, filled only by the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. Enzo stood, his back to her for a moment, looking out the large window that overlooked the city. The city lights twinkled like distant, uncaring stars. He turned back, his expression still unreadable, but the coldness in his eyes had deepened. He didn't say another word, just gave her a curt nod, a dismissal that felt heavier than any shouted reprimand. Kimberly understood. Her time with him, as his employee, as someone under his protection, was over. A different game was about to begin. The question wasn't if there would be consequences, but what kind, and when they would finally arrive. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of a future she couldn't yet see, but knew would be dangerous. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Kimberly's mind drifted back, away from the cold stare of Enzo, away from the echoing slam of his hand. It went back to a time before the threats, before the tension, to the cramped but lively streets of her childhood. She grew up in a part of New York where everyone knew everyone, a place thick with the smell of garlic and simmering tomato sauce, where families lived on top of each other and life revolved around tradition. It was an Italian-American community, tight-knit, where loyalty wasn't just a word, it was a way of life, something passed down with every Sunday dinner. Respect was earned, but also demanded, especially for those older or in positions of power. And there were unspoken rules, a whole language of nods and glances that meant more than any spoken command. She remembered wanting something different, something beyond the narrow streets and the watchful eyes of the neighborhood. As a girl, she'd spend hours sketching, filling notebooks with faces and landscapes that existed only in her head. She dreamed of art school, of galleries, of a life where her biggest worry was mixing the right shade of blue. Or maybe academics, losing herself in books, discovering new worlds through words. But those dreams felt like whispers against the roar of her family's expectations. Her mother, bless her heart, always wanted Kimberly to be practical, to find a good, steady job, preferably one that kept her close to home. Her father, a man of few words but strong convictions, believed in duty above all else. The family business wasn't exactly a business in the traditional sense, but it was how they survived, how they maintained their place in the community. And when things got tough, when her father's health started to fail and the bills piled up, there was only one place to turn for help, one name whispered with a mix of reverence and fear: Enzo. He had always been around, a distant but powerful figure, a friend of her father's, a man who commanded respect. So when the offer came to work for him, it wasn't really an offer. It was an unspoken obligation, a way to pay back a debt that had never been explicitly named but was deeply felt. Kimberly put away her sketchbooks and her dreams of college applications. She put on a sensible suit and walked into Enzo's world. At first, Enzo was just a boss. A stern one, yes, demanding and meticulous, but fair enough in his own way. He expected perfection, and he got it. He had a way of looking at her, a kind of paternal gaze that made her feel seen, even valued. She learned fast, absorbed everything, and became indispensable. She handled his schedules, organized his meetings, managed his contacts. She was good at it, surprisingly good. He often praised her efficiency, her sharp mind, her ability to anticipate his needs. Sometimes he'd even offer a rare, almost gentle smile. In those early days, she saw him as a protector, a strong hand guiding her through a complicated world. He was a father figure in a way, filling a void left by her own father's growing frailty. But beneath that veneer of stern fairness, a different kind of tension simmered. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. A comment about her dress being too distracting for a client meeting. A suggestion that she shouldn't stay out too late with friends because her focus needed to be sharp. He'd ask about her weekends, not in a friendly way, but with an underlying possessiveness that made her uncomfortable. If she mentioned meeting a new person, especially a man, his expression would tighten, his questions becoming more pointed. He'd say things like, "You know who you can trust, Kimberly. You don't want to get involved with the wrong sort." It wasn't advice, it was a warning. She started to notice how he'd always know where she was, even when she hadn't told him. A casual mention of her having coffee at a specific cafe or walking past a certain park. She brushed it off, told herself it was just how things worked in their community. Everyone knew everyone. It was probably just someone mentioning they saw her. But the feeling of being watched, of being subtly controlled, began to grow. She found herself changing her routines, trying to shake off the invisible net she felt closing around her. The father figure she once saw was slowly morphing into something else, something more unsettling. His control, once a reassuring presence, was becoming a heavy burden. She felt her discomfort growing, a quiet alarm bell ringing in the back of her mind, a premonition of the storm that was now truly brewing. The truth was, Enzo's presence in Kimberly's life and in her family's went back much further than her father's health issues. There was a story, whispered in hushed tones at family gatherings, about a time when her grandfather had found himself in a deep hole. A business venture gone sour, debts mounting, and men with ugly tempers knocking on his door. It was Enzo's father, the elder Moretti, who had stepped in. He didn't just lend money, he made problems disappear. He smoothed things over, called in favors, and protected the Rossi family from ruin. It created a bond, an unspoken agreement that stretched across generations. A debt of loyalty, a favor owed, that was never explicitly demanded but always understood. It was the kind of thing that defined their world, a quiet chain linking families together, sometimes for protection, sometimes for control. Kimberly's father, a proud but pragmatic man, never forgot that. His respect for Enzo, the son of the man who saved his own father, was immense. It bordered on reverence, a deep-seated gratitude that often manifested as fear. He would always defer to Enzo, always listen intently to his advice, always ensure that Enzo's wishes were met, even before his own. This dynamic played a huge part in Kimberly's upbringing. From a young age, she understood that Enzo Moretti was not just another family friend. He was the family friend, the one whose name carried weight, whose opinion mattered above all others. She remembered Enzo at her first communion, a tall, imposing figure in a dark suit, his eyes scanning the room, missing nothing. He wasn't just there as a guest, he was there as a presence, a watchful guardian. At her high school graduation, he sent a bouquet of white roses, larger and more expensive than any other. It felt like a mark of ownership, a subtle declaration that she was under his purview even then. These weren't random acts of kindness. They were carefully placed markers, establishing his influence, ensuring everyone understood her connection to him. He was always watching, not in a creepy way, but in a way that made her feel like her life was a stage, and he was a permanent fixture in the audience. There were specific instances where his manipulation of family events became clear, looking back. Her cousin's wedding, for example. Kimberly had been planning to go away to a college out of state, an art school she'd dreamed of. Enzo somehow got wind of it. At the wedding reception, he made a point of pulling her aside, praising her intelligence and her loyalty to her roots. He talked about how important it was for young people to stay close to their families, to contribute to the community that nurtured them. He mentioned that there was always a place for her, right here, where she was needed. Her father, overhearing parts of the conversation, later reinforced the message, urging her to reconsider the risks of going too far away. Suddenly, her dreams of art school felt selfish, a betrayal of her family. She ended up choosing a local university, convincing herself it was her own decision. But the seed of doubt had been planted by Enzo. Her early attempts to assert independence were always met with this kind of subtle disapproval, often channeled through her family. When she started dating a boy who wasn't from their immediate neighborhood, Enzo made a casual comment to her father about the boy's family having questionable connections. Her father, suddenly worried, put pressure on her to end the relationship. She fought it, but the pressure was relentless, and eventually she gave in. It wasn't a direct threat from Enzo, never a harsh word. It was always a veiled suggestion, a quiet word to her father that would then ripple through the family, creating an atmosphere of unspoken expectation that she dared not defy. She tried to push back sometimes, small acts of rebellion, wearing slightly bolder clothes than her mother approved of, arguing for her right to make her own choices. But these attempts were always met with that same quiet disapproval, that heavy silence from her father, or a knowing, almost disappointed look from Enzo when he next saw her. It was a constant, low-level pressure, designed to keep her within the boundaries he implicitly set. She learned quickly that direct confrontation was useless. Her family's devotion to Enzo, born of a long-standing debt and a deep respect for his power, meant they would always side with him, always reinforce his unspoken rules. It made her feel trapped, even before she officially started working for him. The lines of control were already drawn, subtle but strong, weaving through the fabric of her life. She was always Enzo's in a way, even before she knew it. Kimberly's internal struggle grew with each passing year. She had joined Enzo's organization, as expected, taking on a role that was far more administrative than she had ever imagined. But it kept her close, kept her under his watchful eye. Her initial hope was that proving her competence would earn her some respect, some autonomy. She believed that if she worked hard enough, if she was indispensable, Enzo would eventually loosen the reins, allowing her to carve out her own space. But that never happened. Instead, she saw a pattern emerge, a slow, steady erosion of any hope she had for personal or professional freedom. There were so many broken promises, small at first, then larger, always framed as being for her own good. She remembered when she'd proposed a new system for tracking certain assets, something that would have streamlined operations and given her more responsibility. Enzo had listened, nodded, even praised her initiative. He said it was a brilliant idea, exactly what they needed. He promised to implement it, to give her the lead on the project. She worked tirelessly, putting in extra hours, drafting detailed plans. But weeks turned into months, and the project never moved forward. When she finally asked about it, he just dismissed it with a wave of his hand, saying, "Timing wasn't right, Kimberly. Too many other things on my plate. We'll get to it." He made it sound like a minor delay, but she knew it was a deliberate sidestepping. It taught her that her ideas, her efforts, were only valued if they fit into his existing structure, if they didn't challenge his control. The painful silences were even worse than the broken promises. She'd try to talk to him about her career path, about wanting to take on more challenging roles, perhaps even work with different clients. She'd carefully choose her words, trying to sound respectful, appreciative, but also ambitious. Enzo would just listen, his expression unreadable, and then change the subject, or offer a non-committal grunt. Sometimes he'd just stare at her, a long, quiet stare that made her feel small and foolish for even speaking up. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with unspoken disapproval, a clear message that her desires were unimportant, perhaps even inappropriate. She learned to dread those silences, to avoid bringing up anything that might provoke them. It was easier to just keep her thoughts to herself. Emotional aggression became another tool in his arsenal, subtle but effective. Public reprimands for minor infractions were common. Once she had accidentally misfiled a document. It was a simple mistake, easily corrected, but Enzo called her into a meeting with 2 other senior members, not to discuss the error, but to chew her out in front of them. He didn't yell, but his voice was cold, sharp, dissecting her mistake with surgical precision. He made it sound like a catastrophic failure, a personal betrayal of trust. He questioned her attention to detail, her commitment, even her intelligence. The other men sat silently, avoiding her gaze. She felt her face burn, humiliated and exposed. The incident was designed to undermine her confidence, to make her question her own abilities. And it worked. For weeks afterward, she second-guessed every single task, terrified of making another mistake that would earn her another public dressing down. His manipulative behaviors extended to isolating her. He would often frame it as protection. If she became friendly with a male colleague, Enzo would suddenly find reasons to transfer that colleague to a different department or send him on an out-of-state assignment. He'd tell Kimberly, "He wasn't good enough for you, Kimberly. Too much baggage. I'm just looking out for you." Or if she planned to go out with a group of friends from outside the organization, he'd suddenly have an urgent task for her, something that absolutely couldn't wait, keeping her late, forcing her to cancel her plans. He'd then act apologetic, saying, "Family first, Kimberly. You understand?" This is important." He made it sound like he was prioritizing her, but she knew he was just cutting off her connections, making her more reliant on him and the world he controlled. She started to feel like she was living in a bubble, with Enzo as the gatekeeper. Her internal struggle was constant, a quiet battle waged mostly in her own head. She needed stability, that much was true. Her family's financial situation, the unspoken debts, all tied her to Enzo. Leaving meant not just risking her own future, but potentially jeopardizing her family's standing, their safety even. She saw how others who tried to break away were quickly brought back into line, sometimes gently, sometimes with a firmer hand. But the growing sense of entrapment was suffocating her. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage, the bars slowly closing in one by one. Or, every time she felt a flicker of defiance, a desire to break free, the fear would creep in, reminding her of the consequences, the web of obligations that bound her. She would tell herself to be patient, to find another way, but the path forward seemed to narrow with each passing day. The sweet taste of stability was turning bitter, leaving a metallic tang of resentment in her mouth. She was caught, and the walls were getting closer. The quiet battle in Kimberly's head started spilling out into the open, making the psychological environment heavy and suffocating. Arguments became more frequent and heated. They were no longer just professional disagreements about inventory or client negotiations. They turned into personal attacks, veiled criticisms about her choices, her attitude, her loyalty. Enzo would push her, testing her limits, watching her reactions. He'd say things like, "You're getting soft, Kimberly. This isn't a game. You need to toughen up." Or, if she disagreed with a decision, he'd snap, "You think you know better? You think you're above this?" The words stung, not just because of their content, but because of the way he delivered them, with a condescending sneer that dismissed her entirely. She found herself snapping back, her voice sharper, her patience thinner. The lines between professional respect and personal affront blurred until they were indistinguishable. The office, once a place of tense but predictable order, became a battleground of wills. Social pressures from within the organization and the community started to mount. Whispers followed Kimberly wherever she went. "Enzo has a special interest in Kimberly," people would say, their eyes darting between her and Enzo. The meaning was clear, and it wasn't flattering. She felt like an object of speculation, her every move scrutinized, her relationships questioned. Colleagues who once treated her with a friendly professionalism now kept their distance, a subtle shift in their demeanor that spoke volumes. They didn't want to get caught in Enzo's web, and being associated with his special interest was a risk they weren't willing to take. She would catch snippets of conversations, hushed tones, quick glances. It was like being under a microscope, every flaw, every interaction, magnified and distorted. The pressure was immense, a constant invisible weight pushing down on her. Even outside the organization, in her own neighborhood, there were silent judgments. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rossi, who used to greet her with warm smiles and offers of homemade cookies, now just offered a tight-lipped nod. Her cousins, usually boisterous and full of gossip, grew quiet when she entered the room. They noticed the change in Kimberly's demeanor, the way her shoulders were always a little hunched, the shadows under her eyes, the forced smile that rarely reached them. They didn't say anything directly, but their silence was louder than any accusation. It was a judgment, a recognition that she had stepped into a world that had changed her, and not for the better. She felt their disappointment, their concern, and it added to her growing sense of shame and isolation. She was living a lie, pretending everything was fine, but everyone around her seemed to see through the facade. Enzo's jealousy and possessiveness became increasingly overt. He started controlling her schedule with an iron fist. If she had an appointment outside of work, he needed to know every detail: where, when, with whom, and for how long. He'd call her at odd hours, just checking in, but it felt more like an interrogation. He scrutinized her interactions with others, especially men. If she spoke for too long with a delivery driver or a new client, he'd find a reason to call her into his office, asking about the conversation, subtly implying she was being unprofessional or worse, disloyal. He questioned her loyalty constantly. "Are you with us, Kimberly? Or are you thinking of greener pastures?" he'd ask, his eyes narrowed, making it clear that any answer other than absolute devotion was unacceptable. He'd show up unannounced at her apartment building, claiming he was in the neighborhood or just wanted to drop off some paperwork. But she knew it was a way to check on her, to make sure she was where she said she would be. He started demanding that she check in with him every night before going to bed, a quick text or call, just to make sure you're safe. It started innocently enough, a gesture of concern, but it quickly morphed into another chain binding her. If she missed a check-in, her phone would ring incessantly until she answered, Enzo's voice tight with a mixture of anger and concern. "Where were you? Why didn't you call? I was worried sick." He made her feel guilty for not reporting her every move. He even went as far as installing a tracking app on her company phone, claiming it was for security purposes. But she knew it was so he could monitor her location at all times. She started leaving her company phone at the office sometimes, using her personal phone for private calls. But even then, she felt a chill, a sense of being watched. Kimberly's growing sense of isolation became crushing. She felt like she was constantly under surveillance, every action, every word, every thought being judged. She couldn't relax, couldn't be herself. The weight of his scrutiny was suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Her once vibrant spirit was dimming, replaced by a constant vigilance, a need to anticipate his moods, to avoid his anger. She started to pull away from her few remaining friends, not wanting to drag them into her complicated world, not wanting them to become subjects of Enzo's suspicious gaze. She ate alone, went home alone, and spent her evenings staring at the walls of her apartment, feeling the invisible threads of his control tightening around her. The world outside Enzo's orbit seemed to shrink, becoming smaller and smaller until it felt like she was trapped in a tiny, suffocating box with him. The air was thin, and she was desperate for a breath of fresh air, a moment of true freedom. But escape felt impossible, a distant, dangerous dream. The feeling of being watched, of being controlled, became unbearable. Kimberly felt like a puppet, her strings pulled by Enzo's increasingly heavy hand. She knew she had to break free, but every attempt was met with another obstacle, another layer of his possessiveness. The subtle acts of control had given way to outright interference, proving just how far he was willing to go to keep her tethered to him and his world. One evening, she went out with a new acquaintance, Michael. He was a consultant from out of town, charming and genuinely interested in her work and her life beyond the office. It was a simple dinner, a chance to talk about things unrelated to Enzo or the family business. She felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She laughed freely, shared her dreams, and for a few hours she forgot about the constant surveillance. The next morning, Enzo called her into his office. His face was calm, almost pleasant, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. He started by praising her work on a recent project, then casually mentioned, "I heard you had a lovely dinner last night. Michael, wasn't it? A bit out of your usual circle, wouldn't you say?" Kimberly's stomach dropped. She hadn't told anyone about the dinner. He then went on to subtly undermine Michael's professional reputation, mentioning rumors of shady dealings in his past, none of which Kimberly had heard before. He didn't forbid her from seeing Michael, but his words hung in the air, a clear warning. Within a week, Michael's company suddenly pulled out of their contract with Enzo's organization, and Michael himself was transferred unexpectedly to a different city. He sent Kimberly a brief, apologetic message, saying he couldn't explain, but he had to go. Kimberly knew it wasn't a coincidence. Enzo had found a way to end it, quietly, efficiently, and without leaving any direct proof of his involvement. Then came the professional setback, a public humiliation orchestrated by Enzo. Kimberly had been working for months on a major deal, one that promised to open new avenues for the organization and significantly boost her own standing. She had poured her heart and soul into it, negotiating tirelessly, building trust with the other party. The night before the final signing, Enzo called her. He sounded agitated, claiming he had received new information that made the deal too risky. He ordered her to back out, citing vague security concerns. Kimberly argued, presented her facts, explained the meticulous vetting she had done, but he was unyielding. The next day, she had to deliver the news to the other party, who were understandably furious. The deal collapsed, and Kimberly's reputation took a severe hit. Whispers circulated that she had been incompetent, that she had mishandled the negotiations. Enzo, meanwhile, publicly expressed his disappointment in her, reinforcing the narrative that it was her fault. Later, she overheard him telling a colleague that he had saved the organization from a terrible mistake, implying Kimberly's lack of judgment. It was a calculated move, designed to assert his authority, remind everyone who was in charge, and, most importantly, to chip away at Kimberly's confidence and independence. He wanted her to rely only on him, to believe she couldn't succeed without his guidance. The breaking point arrived with an incident that put her directly in harm's way. Enzo had sent her to collect a sensitive package from a contact in a rough part of town. He assured her it was a routine exchange, nothing to worry about. But when she arrived, the situation was clearly volatile. The contact was agitated, surrounded by unfamiliar, aggressive men. A heated argument broke out, and suddenly a gun was drawn. Kimberly, caught in the middle, felt a cold terror grip her. She managed to escape, running through narrow alleys, her heart pounding, the sounds of shouting and a distant gunshot echoing behind her. She made it back to her car, shaken but unharmed. When she confronted Enzo, he merely shrugged. "These things happen, Kimberly. It's the nature of the business. You need to be tougher." He showed no remorse, no concern for her safety. It was then she realized that he hadn't just been careless. He had deliberately put her in that situation, perhaps to test her, perhaps to teach her a lesson about her place. His disregard for her life, her well-being, was starkly evident. That night, alone in her apartment, the silence felt heavy. She stared at her trembling hands, the fear slowly giving way to a cold, burning anger. She couldn't continue like this. She couldn't live under his thumb, constantly fearing for her safety, her reputation, her very existence. The incident had ripped away any lingering illusions she had about his care or concern. He was a predator, and she was his prey. She knew she had to act, and she had to be smarter than him. He controlled everything, but he didn't control her mind, her resolve. She began to discreetly gather information. She started keeping a small, hidden journal, noting down dates, times, and details of Enzo's manipulative actions, his threats, the subtle ways he undermined her. She paid closer attention during meetings, memorizing names, numbers, and key details of his illicit operations. She started making copies of certain documents, small ones at first, just a few pages, hiding them in a secure location outside her apartment. She knew the risk was immense. If Enzo found out, the consequences would be dire, far worse than any lip-biting reprimand. But the thought of staying, of enduring another day under his oppressive control, was even more terrifying. Her patience had completely dwindled, replaced by a steely determination. The constant fear had hardened into a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just planning an escape, she was planning a way to dismantle his control, to expose him, to ensure he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. She spent hours researching, reading about legal loopholes, about how to report organized crime without putting herself in immediate danger. She understood that this wasn't just about her freedom. It was about justice. A major confrontation was no longer just imminent. It was inevitable. She just needed the right moment, the perfect opportunity to strike. And she knew deep down that Enzo, for all his power, was about to underestimate her in a way he would never forget. The deal gone wrong wasn't just a failure. It was a setup. Kimberly discovered this truth not through a dramatic confession, but through a cold, calculated pattern of events. After the near-fatal incident in the rough part of town, she had started looking at everything Enzo did with a new, critical eye. She reviewed the details of that specific job, piecing together the fragmented memories. The contact, Marco, had been overly aggressive, almost baiting the other group. Enzo had insisted she handle it alone, despite her usual protocol requiring a backup. The information she was given about the meeting place and time had been just slightly off, enough to create confusion and delay, placing her at a disadvantage. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. Then she found the ledger. Not the official one, but a small, leather-bound book hidden in the back of a dusty old safe in Enzo's private office, a safe she only knew about because she'd once seen him retrieve a rare cigar from it. Her access to his office was limited, but after the incident, she had started finding ways to be there when he wasn't. She used her knowledge of his habits, her understanding of the building's layout, and a small, almost invisible lock-picking tool she'd learned to use as a child, playing with her mechanic uncle. Inside the ledger, meticulously recorded, were details of transactions that mirrored the deal gone wrong. But these entries included an extra column. Payment to Marco for services rendered. Marco, the agitated contact who had almost gotten her killed, was on Enzo's payroll, not as a client, but as an operative. The ledger revealed Enzo's true intentions with chilling clarity. He hadn't just wanted to test her, he wanted to eliminate her, or at least put her in a situation where her failure would be catastrophic, justifying her removal. He had been systematically setting her up, not just for that one deal, but for several others, subtly undermining her authority, making her appear incompetent to others in the organization. He never intended to let her leave his control. He saw her as an asset to be used, then discarded, or worse, kept as a permanent pawn in his power games. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated anger. He hadn't just betrayed her trust, he had played with her life, her future, as if it were a trivial game. The shocking revelation confirmed all her suspicions. Enzo wasn't just a strict boss, he was a dangerous, manipulative man who saw people as tools. He didn't care about loyalty or family, he cared only about his own power. The realization hit her like a physical blow, yet it also brought a strange sense of liberation. The fog of uncertainty lifted. She no longer had to wonder if she was overreacting, if she was misunderstanding him. It was all real. His possessiveness, his control, his subtle threats, they were all part of a larger, sinister plan. With newfound resolve, Kimberly decided she would not just escape. She would ensure Enzo paid for his actions. She began to secretly record Enzo. She used a tiny digital recorder, no bigger than her thumb, which she had purchased online using a burner credit card. She hid it in her pocket during meetings, placing it strategically on her desk when he called her into his office. She started to gather not just copies of documents, but digital evidence. She created secure cloud storage accounts, password-protected and encrypted, where she uploaded photos of the ledger, recordings of Enzo's most incriminating conversations, and copies of financial records that showed his illegal dealings. She worked late into the night, after everyone else had gone home, using the office computers to access files, knowing that any trace of her activity could be disastrous. The risk was immense, a constant gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. But the anger fueled her, pushing her past the fear. She thought of her family, of the way Enzo had subtly manipulated their lives, of the way he had trapped her. She thought of the young women who had come before her, who had disappeared or been broken by his control. She wouldn't let that happen to her, and she wouldn't let him continue to hurt others. Each piece of evidence she collected was a small victory, a step closer to freedom, a blow against his empire. A cold resolve settled over Kimberly. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival and justice. She knew the path ahead would be dangerous, filled with obstacles and potential betrayals. But she was no longer the naive girl who had bitten her lip in fear. She was a woman armed with knowledge, driven by a fierce determination, ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The game had changed. Enzo had shown his hand, and now it was her turn. She meticulously organized the evidence, creating multiple backups, ensuring that even if she failed, the truth would eventually come out. She was building a case, not just for her escape, but for his downfall. The silence she had once maintained was now a weapon, gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash its full force. Enzo's reaction was exactly what Kimberly had anticipated, yet it still hit her with a chilling force. When he discovered her plans, or rather, the initial breach in his meticulously constructed facade, his calm exterior shattered. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, deliberate tightening of his jaw, a coldness in his eyes that spoke of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't yell. He merely stated in a voice barely above a whisper that she had made a grave mistake. The air in the room, thick with unspoken threats, seemed to press in on her. He had found one of her hidden recording devices, cleverly disguised as a USB drive, tucked away in a desk drawer she thought was secure. It was a minor slip, a test of his surveillance, and she had failed. He didn't need to say more. Kimberly knew what that look meant, what his controlled words implied. The game was up, at least in the office. She had to move, and she had to move fast. She had prepared for this, but the reality of it was far more intense than any simulation in her mind. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and adrenaline. She had a small bag packed, hidden in her car, ready for a quick escape. It contained emergency cash, a burner phone, and a few essential documents, everything she needed to vanish. The immediate fallout was brutal. News of her disloyalty spread like wildfire through the organization, fueled by Enzo's carefully crafted narrative. Some colleagues, those who had always been wary of Enzo but too afraid to act, averted their eyes, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. Others, the sycophants and loyalists, openly condemned her, their faces twisted with feigned outrage and genuine fear of Enzo's retribution. They saw her as a traitor, a snake who had bitten the hand that fed her. Whispers followed her like shadows, condemning her, questioning her motives. But then there were the others, the quiet ones, the ones who had seen Enzo's true colors, who had felt the weight of his control. A few brave souls secretly offered support. An old bookkeeper, a woman named Sophia, slipped a small, folded note into Kimberly's hand as she passed her in the hallway. It read, "Be careful. He's looking for something specific. Don't let him find it." A younger associate, Marco, whom Kimberly had once helped with a complicated financial report, managed to send an anonymous text message to her burner phone. Airport security detail beefed up. Avoid commercial flights. These small acts of defiance, these quiet gestures of solidarity, were a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. They fueled her resolve, giving her strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Her flight was less of a chase and more of a strategic retreat. She knew Enzo would have eyes on the usual exits, the obvious routes. She had planned for this, creating diversions, planting false leads. Instead of heading for a major airport, she drove for hours in the opposite direction, switching cars twice, using pre-arranged contacts to secure vehicles that couldn't be easily traced. She left her main phone behind, knowing it would be a beacon for Enzo's trackers. The tension was constant, a knot in her stomach that never loosened. Every car that passed, every shadow that moved, sent a jolt of alarm through her. The confrontation with Enzo was inevitable, but it wouldn't happen on his terms. She knew he would send people, his enforcers, to persuade her to return, to retrieve what she had taken. The thought of facing them, of enduring their threats and physical intimidation, filled her with a cold dread. But she also felt a strange, exhilarating relief. The pretense was over. The suffocating charade of obedience and loyalty had finally ended. She no longer had to bite her lip, no longer had to hide her true feelings. She was free to act, to fight, to simply be herself, even if that meant being a fugitive. Emotionally, Kimberly was a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. There was the raw, primal fear of being hunted, of the unknown dangers that lay ahead. But beneath that fear, a powerful current of relief coursed through her veins. The constant pressure of living under Enzo's thumb, the mental gymnastics of pretending everything was fine, had been exhausting. Now, despite the peril, there was an honesty to her situation. She was fighting for her life, for her freedom, and there was a clarity in that purpose. She felt a fierce determination, a resolve that hardened her spirit. She was no longer the timid woman who had been manipulated and controlled. She was a survivor, a warrior, ready to face whatever came her way. She knew there was no turning back. Her old life, the one she had built within Enzo's shadow, was gone. Her family, once a source of comfort, was now a potential liability, a lever Enzo could use against her. She mourned the loss of her innocence, the dream of a quiet life, but she also embraced the fierce independence that had been forged in the crucible of her ordeal. This was her new reality, irrevocably changed, dangerous and uncertain, but also brimming with the potential for true freedom. She had crossed a line, burned her bridges, and now she had to build a new path, brick by painful brick. The evidence she carried, hidden in multiple encrypted locations, was her shield and her sword. It was the key to her survival and to Enzo's eventual downfall. She would not surrender. She would not break. This was just the beginning of her fight.